Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this National Advocacy Summit session, Dismantling White Privilege, Race, Religious Freedom, and Christian Nationalism. I am Dr. Sabrina Dent, and I serve as the Senior Faith Advisor for Americans United for Separation of Church and State. In today's session, we will explore America's long history of proclaiming the values of religious freedom while being selective for whom this is actually granted. Most times, this came with the expectation that to practice religion freely and openly meant practicing a type of Christianity that reflected and sustained a white majority. Today, you will hear from a diverse group of voices that will discuss how working for religious freedom puts us on the front lines of addressing racism and Christian nationalism in America. With that, I would like to introduce our presenters. However, I invite you to read their full bios on the conference webpage at au.org/conference. We've had with us today Dr. Robert P. Jones, CEO and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute and author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. We also have Dr. Kiyati Joshi, Professor of Education at Fairleigh Dickinson University and author of White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality in America. We also have Amanda Tyler, Executive Director of the BJC, that is the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, and the lead organizer for Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We also have Reverend Naomi Washington Leapart, who is a professor of theology and religious studies at Villanova University and the AU Faith Advisory Council member. And our moderator for today's program is Dr. Corey D.B. Walker. He is the Wake Forest Professor of Humanities and the author of the books Noble Fight, African American Freemasonry and the Struggle for Democracy in America, as well as the editor of Community Wealth Building and the Reconstruction of American Democracy. Can we make American democracy work? So with that, I introduce Dr. Corey D.B. Walker.
Thank you, Sabrina. And I'm glad to be joined by such an august panel who will help us begin to untangle and really think through the complexities of this particular conversation. When we begin to approach this topic, it's made all the more challenging in a moment when we see in our everyday lives the practice of invidious forms of racial and religious intolerance and bigotry. Our panelists today will help us receive some tools of how to think about this moment, how to critically address questions around religious freedom in this particular intense partisan moment, and ways in which we can continue to build a democracy for all Americans. I want to begin our conversation with Robert. Robert, your recent book really lays out a map of how Christian religion and white supremacy are intertwined. Can you begin to open up our conversation today by thinking through what's the relationship between Christianity and white supremacy in the U.S.?
Thanks, Corey, and happy to be here with, such an amazing panel today to tackle these complex and important issues. I've got it right there in the title of the book, White Supremacy and the Legacy of American Christianity. And one of the things that, I sort of discovered along the way and make clear and got confirmed really in my research is how entangled these concepts of white supremacy have been with American Christianity really all the way back, to the colonial era. And it really is they're bound up together. And so, if you think on the one hand, we get the term Christian nationalism we're talking about today. On the other hand, we get the term white supremacy. And I think what the history makes clear, again, is that these have always been sort of wrapped together. And what it's really been about has been historically protecting a place of privilege and power for those who could fit into this category. We even have an acronym for it, WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, right? That has been the privileged category of power and the category that's been protected throughout American history there. And it's very, I think one way of kind of thinking about this, I'll give you just two examples, show you how much this has been with us. In the second incarnation of the KKK in the 20th century, in the 1920s, it's worth noting that this was not just an anti-Black group, but the KKK was an explicitly white Protestant Christian group that explicitly, was taking action against not only African Americans in the country, but against Jews and Catholics in the country, right? As folks who were not legitimately American in their eyes, and threats to the America that they wanted to see. And one of the one I think is disturbing is that in 1942, none other than FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, infamously said in a private comment, but that got preserved, this is a Protestant country. Jews and Catholics and others are here by sufferance, right? So even among what's considered, I think, a fairly progressive, president, this marriage between kind of white Christianity and white supremacy are very, very tied, and just put out there, I think, in very unapologetic ways in our not so distant past. And so I think this moment of reckoning that's upon us is, a time for us to, I think once and for all, really have a real reckoning with that history, and to begin to excise, this kind of sinister presence from within our democracy and within our faith.
Thank you so much, Robert. You really laid out how Christianity is bound with white supremacy in the U.S. experience, and how it arrests the development of a broad, more robust democratic experience for all Americans. Now I want to turn to Keontae, who really challenges us to expand what Robert talks about in his book about the boundedness of white Christianity and white supremacy. Keontae, you remind us in your book that the idea of religious freedom and religious liberty is underwritten by a white Christian normativity that has all too often acted in very invidious ways. Can you talk to us a bit about how you understand white Christian privilege operating under the guise of religious freedom and religious liberty, and the challenges it presents to our democratic enterprise?
Christianity and colonization both start with C's, and they kind of go together. The Bible was seen as the world's constitution. And so when as we learned in elementary school, the explorers, I think today we would call them the colonizers, set out, religion was right there in terms of claiming land. We can go back to the 15th century with the papal decrees and the doctrine of discovery. And the doctrine of discovery, which stated essentially, if you come upon land that is not inhabited by Christians, it's yours for the taking, really actually undergirds this idea of American exceptionalism, undergirds manifest destiny, this idea, right, this land is ours to take from sea to shining sea. And I say ours, but I would not have been included in that hour. And the Puritans came here seeking religious freedom. Of course, this is the myth we all learn in first grade, but actually they weren't seeking it for everybody. They were in it for themselves, right? And so all of this history has not been taught. We've not learned it. We say we're a land for religious freedom. And what happened was religion's difference, race morphed into racial difference. You have to go back again to the Iberian Peninsula, where we really see things getting started. We fast forward to the colonial, pre-colonial time, pre-revolutionary time here in the United States, and we see racial difference being talked about in terms of freedom, in terms of heathen and Christian, civilized and uncivilized. And really, what we see is if you have two race cars together, imagine two race cars together, one's Christianity and one's whiteness. And once we declared our independence, and once we get the First Amendment, it's as if the white car just takes over, but the Christian car is right there. It's right there, but it becomes invisible often. And that's what I set out to do in the book, is to show actually how whiteness and Christianity have gone together from the beginning.
Thank you so much, Keontae. You really remind us that if we're thinking about religion and racial difference, and we understand that inflected in that racial difference is notions of racial superiority, we then must understand how it normalizes itself in the very principles and practices that argue for equality, but yet yield a radical difference in terms of the denial of equality for so many Americans throughout the American experience. Amanda, Robert, and Keontae have really laid out a very impressive list of ideas that we have to wrestle with. And most recently, you led an organizing effort around Christians against Christian nationalism, where you really wanted to take into account the American exceptionalist idea that America is a uniquely Christian nation and it has this particularly normative citizenship is very deleterious to the exercise of a robust democratic society. Can you talk to us a bit about that effort and what you're attempting to do by leading and organizing this effort against Christian nationalism in this moment?
Sure. Well, BJC, Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, has been leading an effort called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. It's ongoing, I want to be sure, and I'm sure we're going to talk about some opportunities to join in later, but you can learn more at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. We found that this idea of Christian nationalism, a political ideology or cultural framework that really merges Christian and American identities, was really problematic, not just to our American democracy, not just to our foundational values of religious freedom for all, but also to Christians and to the integrity of the Christian religion. So if we are going to salvage Christianity, then we need to call out Christian nationalism and try to disentangle those two things. So we launched the Christians Against Christian Nationalism effort to really raise awareness about what Christian nationalism is, but also to raise awareness for the unifying principles of religious freedom for all that really work as an antidote to the poison of Christian nationalism. The idea that one's religious affiliation or lack thereof is irrelevant to one's standing in the civic community. The idea that patriotism does not require us to minimize our religious convictions. Those core values, if we affirm those, can unite us across lines of religious difference, unite us across lines of political difference, and work against the poison of Christian nationalism.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Naomi, thus far we've wrestled with the legacy of Christianity, colonization, and civilization, how they're bound together, how white supremacy and white Christian identity are bound together, and how it is morphed in our moment to the expression of a Christian nationalism that mitigates against broad religious difference and broad ethnic difference. In your work with Americans United, what religious resources from the plurality of religious orientations available in the US do you see or do you understand that offer us some critical ways to begin to approach this deleterious intersection between race, religious freedom, and Christian nationalism?
So, I think about this, ideas have consequences. This is what I tell my students in theology classrooms every semester, that what we discuss here may feel abstract, may feel esoteric, but these ideas lead to the development of ethical frameworks that then guide political decision-making, whether that's personal decision-making or kind of a corporate or collective representative decision-making. And so I think that one resource that we have to leverage is the resource of sound theological education. And I mean that in a formal sense, and I mean that in a kind of organic, informal sense, right? That our faith communities themselves have to become spaces of rigorous theological wrestling, theological critique, that white supremacy started first as an imagined thought. And when that thought could be connected to a theological framework, once you could sanctify white supremacy, you then ensure its existence in perpetuity, right? And so there needs to be a sophistication in Christian communities around this transition from an idea, a concept, a value, to an ethical framework and ultimately a politics that is harmful. So I think that we need to, those of us who are steeped in academic spaces, need to bridge the gap to make sure that the theological musings and wrestlings that we do in the classroom make their way over to the pew. That religious leaders who may or may not be trained formally get access to the kinds of conversations that help them shift their pastoral practice. And I think we need some courage, some theological courage. I find my classroom to be a place of bravery, a place where students can take risks with new ideas, new ways of being. And that kind of courage needs to also exist in our faith community. So I think that's true too. At the same time, I think that many academic and scholarly conversations frame this as a kind of good religion and bad religion, or good Christianity and bad Christianity conversation. And I think that that's dangerous because, as my colleagues here have already said, there has from the beginning been this insidious relationship between Christian practices, Christian doctrines, and kind of alliances, allegiances, loyalties to the state, loyalties to systems of domination. And so we have to admit that the Bible has always been a contested text, that there are ways in which we can't pretend that the Bible doesn't say some of the things it says around complicity in violence, around subjugation of peoples, right? So I think that in our exploration, we also need to be honest. And I don't know if honesty is a resource, but honesty is certainly a tool that helps us get to where we need to be. If we can be honest about the fact that Christian progressives have to deal with the same disagreements in the biblical text, right, that that non-Christian people contend with in terms of critiques back into Christianity, right? We can have a more honest struggle, a struggle that doesn't say we're right about Christianity or you're wrong about Christianity, but instead says that Christianity is messy and complicated, and sometimes we contradict ourselves. And that kind of humility and honesty will help us see a way forward.
Thank you, Naomi. Your call for an honest reckoning with the real messiness of Christianity and of religion in general really underscores the real challenge of these sorts of conversations in our public space, in a moment where we have these heightened divides around religion, race, as well as immigration. I want to turn back to Robbie, because Robbie, in your work at Public Religion Research Institute, you've done some interesting work in finding out the ways in which racial identity and religious identity are wedded together, particularly around white religious identity. Can you talk to us a bit about the intertwining in our contemporary moment of heightened religiosity or continuing religiosity and white racial identity, and what it means for our American public square?
Right now we're gearing up for, this upheaval that happens in our country every 4 years, a big presidential election. And of course, one of the things that happens there is that partisan identity, comes to the fore in a way. It's already fairly strong in our country, but it comes to the fore with a vengeance. I think, and one of the things that I think is challenging for us in the country is that, we've already been talking about race and religion, but the other sort of, leg on this three-legged stool is partisanship. And to think about how partisanship has sorted the country is really troubling. So for example, today, if you look at the contemporary Republican Party, among self-identified Republicans, they're about 70% white and Christian. today. You look at the Democratic Party, it's only about a third white and Christian. So in other words, the Republican Party is about twice as likely to be made up of white Christians as the Democratic Party is. Now, if you're thinking about a healthy pluralistic democracy, and this disparity has been getting bigger. I mean, this is not a recipe, right, for a healthy democracy, because it lends us with one party that is drifting toward, being essentially a monolithic a party of white Christian nationalism. I mean, that is really the worry, I think. And the other party kind of being the default party of everyone else here. And what is animating that is a set of racial, often a set of racial and religious grievances that is about exactly this topic we're talking about. It's about power, and it's about who is at the top of the social, political, and cultural pyramid in the country. And I think, what's been remarkable as a public opinion researcher over the last few years, and particularly with the 2016 election, it became clear to us, looking at the data, that the big divides were ceasing to be about policy. They were much more about identity. So we weren't fighting necessarily over healthcare or even immigration policy, but we were fighting over this bigger concept. I think really pointing to some of the things that many of the other panels have said, over America, right? When you think about the word America, who is America? Who are we as a country, and who are we not as a country? And I think in particular for white Protestants in this country who have been accustomed to thinking of themselves as America, right? This kind of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant vision that we are America. And in a country that is, no longer even white and Christian, if you put all white Christians together, right? Today, the country is only 44% white and Christian, down 10 points from where it was even a decade ago, right? So we have ceased, demographically speaking, even to be a white Christian country. And yet I think our politics, often that really is, I think, much of the pullback for nostalgia, the sense of kind of resisting cultural and religious change in the country is really wrapped up in this kind of racial and religious identity that is now just shot through with the partisan divide.
Robbie, I think you hit the nail on the head with that, and really underscoring the politics of nostalgia that are operating, that are really bringing in these regressive forms of religious and racial identity that really attenuates the full flourishing of a broad democratic public. Reality that only 44% of our nation identifies as white and Christian in our contemporary moment is really a moment where we have to begin to think about what it means to be American, what religious freedom means in this moment, as well as how we begin to understand the norms that inform the principles of our democratic society. Kiati, can you really contextualize the ways in which a Christian normativity that operates in this moment, how it denies the very vitality of religious pluralism in the US, and how it denies the expression of the worth, value, and dignity of all Americans who are trying to achieve their American dream?
Yeah, I think, first of all, you have to think about Christian normativity as just, business as usual, right? That's the way to think about it. So Christian folks who identify as Christian can go about their day, can attend their worship service. Society is constructed around that. The idea that any community, any religious community should be able to put up a house of worship would seem plausible, especially if we say we have freedom of religion. And yet we have countless examples across this country of synagogues, gurudwaras, Hindu temples, mosques, being denied, communities being denied the ability to do that. And all kinds of reasons are set forward. They say that, it'll become a public nuisance. There'll be so much parking. There'll be issues with traffic and where are we going to park all the cars. People start talking about property value going down. And it's a little bit of, well, there goes the neighborhood, and so these religious communities are not able to put up their houses of worship. And sometimes if they are, it's at tremendous cost because of litigation. There is the ability to celebrate holidays. And for some of us as an academic, you know, I canceled class on Diwali. But when I wasn't tenured, you know, sometimes I wondered if students were going to complain because I canceled class and then I was making it up. And if that's inconvenient, then students could complain, right? So then what does that do to my, what does that do in terms of my career and in terms of my job? So not everybody can just say, hey, I'm going to take the day off. There are consequences. So it manifests in those ways. It also manifests in the ways of what's considered religious, what's considered normal, and what's not. And we see this actually even in research, right? So many studies are about congregationalism. So it's about measuring religiosity by how many people are attending the particular house of worship. Well, not every religion has a weekly gathering. And so then how are those religions being depicted? How do we know what is going on? We have to alter our research practices, right? How are we talking about language? I was part of the Pew study on Asian American religions that came out back in 2012. And I will tell you, on the first draft that we saw, ideas around practices around meditation were categorized as New Age religion. You know, Buddhism, Hinduism, this is not New Age. Right? These have been around for thousands of years. So the language that is used to describe religions. So those are some kind of specific ways we see a Christian norm arising.
Thank you so much. You really underscore the cost of Christian normativity, the cost to really understanding the diversity of the religious ecology of America, the opportunities to really learn cross-culturally and across lines of religious orientation and across lines of faith. Amanda, building on that, what are some of the costs of this growing normativity or the attempted normativity around a Christian nationalist orientation in our contemporary moment?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I was reflecting also on what Naomi said earlier, and I think this links about, you know, being careful of not labeling good religion and bad religion, as if there's only one type of religion that's Christian nationalist or has Christian nationalism tendencies, because I think it is such an insidious presence in our culture that it pervades in ways that we don't even notice, you know, in ways, you know, that Kathy was just pointing out, you know, that operates almost like religious privilege. And so I think we're in the danger of Christian nationalism is so pervasive that it's normative, right? That this is just, when we think about what Christianity looks like in the United States, it's difficult sometimes to separate it from Christian nationalism. And I think that concern was one of the animating drivers of Christians against Christian nationalism. That it wasn't just us, but there were a lot of other Christians who were really concerned about the long-term impact on our religion and thought it was time to take a public stand against Christian nationalism, in not a way that was trying to, you know, say bad names or put people in boxes, but to try to claim Christian nationalism as a problem that infects us as well. That if we can't name it, we can't start to work against it. And it's a lot of the same way, I think. It's not the same thing, but there's a lot of overlap with how racism operates in our society. That there aren't just some people who are racist, but it's so pervasive that it impacts us all in different ways. And if we can start to notice it, call it out, then we can start to dismantle it in lots of the same ways we're trying to do with Christian nationalism.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Naomi, Amanda has reminded us that we need to name what we're trying to fight against and also begin to define it, and picking up and extending your comment around identifying good and bad religion. She reminds us that there are some religious resources available for us to begin to combat the scourge of Christian nationalism. What do you see as some religious practices or religious communities that can really inform our particular moment when we see such heightened and invidious forms of religion being deployed to marginalize the lives and life chances of so many Americans. What sorts of resources do we have? You talk about some resources that are available in order to respond to this contemporary moment.
Sure. What can develop when people have their backs against the wall and they want to be faithful? They create ways of connecting to the transcendent, to the divine, that necessarily transgress and subvert the system, because that system is an infringement on their very dignity, right? And so you named Black Christianity as necessarily forming right in the hush harbors, in the places outside of institutional religious life. And so we can look there too in our contemporary moment. There are, Christian adjacent folks who may have been formed, steeped in institutionalized Christianity, who could maintain a commitment to following the way of Jesus, for example, maintain a commitment to a radical inclusivity, a radical hospitality, but who have become so, perhaps rightly disenfranchised by institutionalized religion, what I've been calling lately Christianity Incorporated. And so if we look to those folks as church planters, I mean, to use that kind of terminology, these are folks who have built community around an ethic, around a way of being, around an imagination, and not around a set of doctrines that you must assent to, not around even the social capital that we glean often from our religious communities. They for me model a way out and a way beyond the kind of religious binds and chains that are keeping us encumbered. And I also think that the movements for racial justice, the movements for LGBTQ justice, and other kinds of movements also light a way forward for this movement out of Christian nationalism. I'm thinking about lately the I guess public discourse around defunding and abolition, right? And we're talking about that in a kind of criminal justice context. We're talking about that in terms of policing. What if we talked about that in terms of Christian nationalism, or in terms of religion that is or bigotry, really cloaked in religious rhetoric? What would it mean to abolish Christianity Incorporated? Full stop. What would it mean to defund institutions that continue to use religious frameworks to, as someone said earlier, subsidize and bankroll this kind of insidious, toxic religiosity? What would that mean for us to walk away from continuing to invest our time, our resources into those institutions? I think that's a model, or at least a theoretical framework worth considering. And so while that's not seen as a religious resource, I think it can be a resource to religious folk who are trying to extricate themselves from these institutional constraints.
Naomi, that's a powerful idea. Robbie, I want you to pick up on this idea that Naomi put out, and I'm going to ask all of us to respond to it. What would it look like if we're trying to get to the deep roots of the imbrication between white Christianity and white supremacy? What would it look like for a new moment in American democracy?
Well, I think some of this is already happening. If we think about what this really means, is that people abandoning institutions that they see being complicit in these structures and this work. We're actually seeing that happening. We know that all white Christian groups, for example, are declining. They've been declining, across as a proportion of the population. I mean, some of that is certainly about kind of white racial decline, but it can't all be explained by that. The other part of it is young people leaving white Christian churches. They're disaffiliating. And at least one of the reasons why is this sense that it's become an over-politicized kind of tool of partisanship, and that it's been wrapped up in things like anti-gay politics, that also is kind of wrapped up in a partisan kind of identity. So this over-politicization and it becoming a tool for political ends, I think is something that many young people find very distasteful, right? And they voted with their feet. So I think in some ways, Naomi, we're seeing this happening right before our eyes, right? And when we ask young people, for example, even those who were raised religious and left, when we ask them today on surveys, are you looking for a religious community that might be a better fit for you? 93% of them say no, right? They are done, kind of none and done. And I think it's because for many of them, it's been either an experience of kind of distasteful because it's been kind of ugly, and it's been kind of propping up these divisions in our country, or it's just come to be seen as wholly irrelevant to the things that really matter to them. So I think we're already seeing some of that, but I do think we're facing a moment of reckoning in a way that I think. So I'm 52. I was born in 1968. So I don't remember, the sort of civil rights era, but I would say as I've been conscious as an adult, I don't think I've seen another moment of reckoning like the one we're facing right now, where the question is going to be put to white Christian churches, to white Christian clergy, is to kind of, okay, at this moment, and we're talking about racial injustice, where are you? Like, I don't, King, excoriated the kind of, the more quote unquote respectable white Christian churches that were silent during the civil rights movement. He had this line where he said, who are these people, right, who are sitting so comfortably behind their anesthetizing stained glass windows, right, whose consciences were unmoved by the great struggle for equality that they saw all around them. And that's putting it generously. For the most part, actually, white Christian churches were actively resisting the civil rights movement and efforts at desegregation. So I don't think that option and surviving is one that's on the table for white Christian churches. I think they're going to have to address this moment, which is going to require, I think, along these lines, telling the truth, right? Telling the truth about our past, and telling the truth and bearing witness to a different kind of future.
Thanks so much, Robbie. Kayati, Robbie has reminded us that there's a reckoning already going on in congregations and white congregations right now. Do we see abolition Christianity eroding the very norms of Christianity that form and guide the ways in which we think about religious freedom and religious liberty and religion's place in the public square?
Well, I think that it is important to keep in mind that while the unaffiliated population has been growing, and folks identifying as Christians has been declining, which, by the way, is causing tremendous anxiety amongst those who identify as white and Christian, right? They feel their identity as under attack. Those of us who try to claim this country for the promise that it holds in terms of racial, religious diversity, for example, the more we try to claim that, the more anxiety producing and the more anxiety filled white Christian America gets. And of course, then that manifests in a variety of different ways, including with the election of the current president. But I think that what we also have to take a look at is the power of Christianity in our social structures and legal structures, and how that's not going to necessarily, that's going to take a long time, and that's going to take some serious intentionality to help make more pluralistic. So for example, often when minorities of a variety, whether we're talking gay and lesbian rights, we're talking racial minorities or religious minorities, when minorities try to claim something that the majority population has, especially the conservative Christians, have done a very good job at messaging in saying they're wanting special rights. And we first saw this with the LGBT community in the 80s and going into the 90s, that they want special rights. Well, no, they didn't want special rights. They wanted marriage equality. They wanted rights that heterosexuals had. We see this often every December when, you know, there's the issue of the creche and the Christmas trees and everything. And when when religious minorities want representation, some Christian communities, you know, don't like it. These are congregations, but these are not necessarily congregations. These are just local communities who kind of feel like, well, putting up a tree is a very American thing. It's not necessarily a very Christian thing, which I think many Christians take offense to, as they should, right? So I think what we have to start doing is reframing the questions, right? Who gets to, thus far, evangelical Christians and other conservative Christian groups have been able to define the moral issues of this country. And so they've become around abortion and gay and lesbian issues. Why isn't environmental justice a moral issue? Why isn't racial justice a moral issue? Now we're seeing that, and it has been for some communities, but we're definitely, I completely agree with what Robbie was saying. We're in this reckoning. I'm not that much younger than you, Robbie, so I'm with you in that I've never seen this. And someone who has been focused on racial justice and social justice education within K through 12 education for over 2 decades now, it is definitely different. And I'm very encouraged, but what we have to understand, I think, as a country, is that if we're talking race, we're not race neutral. And if we're talking about religion, it's not religion neutral. The starting point is white Christian supremacy.
Amanda, Chianti reminded us that abolition Christianity must deal with the very normativity of Christianity that informs and guides the principles of our legal institutions, our juridical institutions, and the ways in which we organize everyday life in the US. How can abolition Christianity serve as a resource in your battle against Christian nationalism in this moment?
Yeah, I love Naomi's Christianity Inc. I'm gonna repeat that. I'll give you credit. And you know, Robbie, you're anesthetizing stained glass. You have clarifying stained glass, Naomi, to bring us to this point. You know, I think that one of the main issues we have, I agree that we were in the reckoning, and in the pandemic for that matter too, we are just accelerating change. And the way that religion was founded in this country was to be disestablished from the country, that we would be supporting our religious institutions with private dollars, right? And so that should have set up a system that would allow people to show with their support or their lack of support, you know, support for our religious institutions. We're at a moment where we are moving in the exact wrong direction, particularly at the Supreme Court. And I'm noticing, you know, the work that Americans United does, and BJC is a partner in that, that we are actually, as perhaps as private support for religion is on the decline, the Supreme Court is showing more and more support for public support for religion. And that should be very troubling to us, that we are really eroding one of the core foundations of religious freedom that said that we would not have government support, dollar support for religion. And we still do live in a Christian normative society. And so that dollar support is going to show for dollar support for Christianity. And so I just wanted to point out that very important legal issue that is undergirding and surrounding us right now, that we're going to have to continue to say no to public support for religion and religious institutions. And we're living in a time when even that basic principle is being questioned by the Supreme Court. That's what immediately came to mind when we talked about defunding Christianity Incorporated. We actually have a constitutional system that was built on that principle, and support for that principle is eroding right now. And I think that is one sign of Christian nationalism gaining a really important foothold in our system.
Naomi, abolition Christianity, defunding Christian Inc. We're seeing a way, we're in a moment where religious freedom and religious liberty is being weaponized, such that the wall between church and state slowly eroding. What do we do in this particular moment to begin to fight for a robust religious freedom that guarantees and authorizes the full and free expression of faith communities and those of no faith, in creating and continuing to extend this American experiment with democracy?
Well, I think as Amanda has just alluded to, I think that we have to, we who are concerned with these issues, we who, believe in freedom, have to get educated and involved in the advocacy campaigns run by organizations like AU, like BJC, particularly around local and state-based legislation that is mired in this expression of Christianity that is so harmful. There are all these little bills, state by state, that are seeking to undermine the religious plurality that we claim to have. And not just that, seeking to impose on people, whether they're Christian folks or not, a particular kind of piety, a particular kind of morality that ultimately is damaging and destructive. So I'm thinking about all of the religious exemption legislation that get quietly, these pieces of legislation get quietly passed in state houses around the country. And the general public has no idea, even people who living in those states, thinking about the imposition of a particular kind of textbook, for example, the use of certain textbooks in states like Texas. I'm thinking about the restrictions around the extent to which there can be even student organizing and advocacy in certain schools related to inclusion of all people, regardless of gender identity and sexual orientation. The prohibition on teachers in those schools to actually support and help students who need that support get the resources they need from their various school districts. So, school boards, what's happening in state houses, I have been honored, I think, to be introduced to this stuff as part of my work, as part of my kind of 9-to-5 work throughout my career. And now that I see, I can't unsee. So it takes tracking these pieces of legislation. There are various sites. The ACLU has one. I'm sure AU has a tracker where we can monitor the proliferation of these religious imposition bills, and then do what we can to push and hold our elected officials, appointed officials accountable for doing right by us. So I think that's one thing we can do. Make it your business to track state legislation. And blitzwatch.org is the website where you can go plop in your state and it'll all come up. And then you can get to calling and writing and visiting your legislators and telling them that you reject this imposition of religious nationalism. And so I think that's one strategy. The other thing I would say is, we have to make some personal commitments. We who are people of faith, we who call ourselves Christian, have to make a personal commitment to rejecting a pietistic kind of faith that is wrapped up in, the interests of the state, the interests of the dominant culture, and decide for ourselves, even if it means breaking rank within the very powerful institutions that we're affiliated with, to be on the right side of history and to be in solidarity with everyday people, to not allow our piety, our desire to be good and righteous people, to seduce us into aligning with institutions that actually violate our deepest moral commitments. And so, I think that that's a personal challenge, and that plus the public challenge or the political challenge, I think that we can get there.
Thank you so much, Naomi. The political and the personal coming together to move us to a broader, more robust democracy. Robbie, as we prepare to close, what do we do in this moment? How do we disentangle white supremacy and white Christianity?
Well, small question for the end. I think it begins. I mentioned before. I'll start where I left off. I think it begins, and here I'm talking specifically to white Christians, with telling the truth. I think I read a lot of James Baldwin working on this book, and one of the things Baldwin saw himself doing, I think, is bearing witness. He used that very Christian language, bearing witness to the truth. And being willing to tell the truth, even when it's really uncomfortable, even when it's fairly ugly, and even when it's like shocking or embarrassing. And I think that that's what is sort of the task before us. And since we've been talking about religious liberty, in this thing, I think the other thing to put squarely in front of white Christians is, and particularly white Protestants, again, who have been accustomed to being kind of at the top of this, or the center of kind of their, the way they thought about themselves is kind of the center of what it meant to be American. But there's a way in which white Protestants have given lip service to religious liberty without ever having to really do it in a way that was costly to them. And that is, as long as they were the dominant cultural force in the country, you can pay all kinds of lip service to it and know that at the end of the day, you still have enough cultural and political dominance to check any real threats to your place in the pyramid. But this is the first generation to where that's no longer true, right? Again, we're less than a majority white Christian country. It was never true that white Christians owned the table, even if they kind of acted as if they did. And that was kind of the model, like, we own the table, we're going to be generous and let you other Catholics, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, pull up Muslims pull up a chair. But it's still, don't you forget, it's a table we own. Right. But I think the new model, is, can white Christians find the courage? I think that's right. I think Naomi, said this is, it's a time for courage, and can white Christians find the courage to be willing to sort of give up the futile efforts to own the table, and to be willing to pull up a chair equally with other religious groups, other racial groups in the country. If we can do that, I'm gonna close with James Baldwin here again. Magnificent, vision of his. These are his words. We can end the racial nightmare, we can achieve our country, and we can change the history of the world.
Thank you so much, Robbie. It's always good to end with a statement from Jimmy Baldwin. Kiati, can we marshal that courage to not only break asunder white Christianity and white supremacy, but can we begin to eliminate white Christian privilege as it infects all of our society?
We can, and it's going to start with education. So just like we are seeing now school boards and parents and families across the country saying, hey, what's being taught in our school vis-a-vis race in America? We need to be teaching about religions, and the school boards have so much power, and communities are going to have to get active. And so everyone watching needs to understand and know what's going on and being taught in the schools. Because if we have students a generation from now, when they're adults, understanding more about religious diversity, understanding it in a very lived way, not just in a Wikipedia way, then we have people making decisions in the boardrooms, on our city council, in our county legislatures, in our state legislatures, and even Congress, making decisions from a different point of view, right? If we can recognize that we should not question someone's patriotism because they are religious and racial minorities, and we do elect them to office, and then they are making decisions from that perspective, we're going to get different kinds of opinions being handed down. So there's a reason I'm a professor of education. It starts with education, and we really need to start having some serious education around world religions in our schools.
Thanks, Kiati. Amanda, courage, education, and a commitment to moving beyond white Christianity. What more do we need in this moment to move us beyond the antagonisms and move us truly against a white Christian nationalism?
I think we need to be willing to take that first step. You know, Christian nationalism has been with us for centuries, and I think the enormity of the problem, the pervasiveness of it, can sometimes lead to defeatism. Like, what can we do about this? But I think that particularly the events of the last few years have shown us that it is time for us to do something about Christian nationalism. And it's going to start relationship by relationship, conversation by conversation, maybe even around some dinner tables. Should we be able to gather with family again in the midst of pandemic, or in Zoom rooms or in other conversations? And that was one of the main ideas behind Christians Against Christian Nationalism, was that we wanted to provide a platform and some resources for people to be able to talk with each other about what Christian nationalism is, to better be able to spot it, and to be able to disentangle it from Christianity, and to help dismantle white supremacy as well. And so I would just encourage those watching to go to christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. If you're a Christian, add your name as a public signer to the statement. And whether you're a Christian or not, check out our resources and help to have some conversations with others about what Christian nationalism is.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Naomi, Amanda, Kiati, and Robbie, thank you for a deeply informative conversation, very thoughtful, but most importantly, it was a very courageous conversation that challenged us to move beyond Christianity as a white supremacist framework, to move beyond a normative Christianity that in some cases really animates a white Christian nationalism, and that funds and fuels a Christianity Inc. that needs to be defunded, and a form of Christianity that needs to move to an abolitionist framework. Today's conversation has provided not only myself, but I know those assembled at this gathering, to really challenge and move forward to a new day where we have robust expressions of democracy built on a deep appreciation for a new experience of religious freedom in our time. Thank you so much. And let me turn it back over to Sabrina.
Thank you so much, Corey, and to all of our panelists. I am so grateful for each one of you, Dr. Robert Jones, Dr. Kiati Joshi, Amanda Tyler, Reverend Naomi Washington Leapart. I am so grateful for your thoughtful insights, and as Corey said, this courageous discussion, which challenges us to think more critically about our responsibility to addressing issues of race and religious freedom and Christian nationalism. And one of the things that I love that you shared, that there must be truth-telling and education via religious literacy, and a commitment to dismantling structures of white Christian privilege. So I want to say again, thank you for all of your thoughtful insights, and thank you to all of our viewers watching today's session. Have a great day.